She had designed the very plane she was being removed from. And not one person in that cabin knew it. Not the gate agent who flagged her ticket. Not the flight attendant who called security. Not the supervisor who stood in the aisle with crossed arms and an apologetic smile that wasn't really apologetic at all. None of them knew. But the captain did. And what happened in the next 4 hours would change every single one of their lives forever. Her name was Dr. Vivienne Calloway Rhodes. And if you had passed her on the street that morning, if you had seen her walking through the pre-dawn darkness of Terminal C at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, rolling a single carry-on bag, wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over dark slacks, her natural hair gathered neatly above her head in a way that suggested both precision and effortlessly, you might have noticed something about her that was difficult to articulate. There was a stillness to her. A kind of deep internal quiet that people who have accomplished extraordinary things sometimes carry, not as arrogance, but as a settled knowing. As if the world around her could churn and spiral and shout, and she would simply continue moving forward at exactly the pace she had always intended. She was 44 years old. She had 2 PhDs, one in aerospace engineering from MIT, and one in materials science from Caltech. She had spent the first decade of her career at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where she had contributed to 3 separate missions and received a commendation from the administrator herself. She had spent the second decade at a private aerospace firm called Vantara Systems, where she had risen to the position of chief design engineer, and where her work on composite fuselage architecture, the precise arrangement of carbon fiber and titanium alloy that determined how a commercial aircraft held together under the extraordinary pressures of high-altitude flight, had been described by Aviation Week and Space Technology as a generational leap in structural engineering philosophy. She had not shared any of this with anyone at the airport. She didn't think she needed to. She had a ticket. A first-class ticket. Seat 2A, Transamerica Airlines Flight 1147, Chicago O'Hare to San Francisco International, departing at 6:15 in the morning. She had purchased it 11 days earlier using her own money and her own credit card. She had checked in online the previous evening, selected her meal preference, the fruit plate and black coffee, and confirmed her seat assignment. Her boarding pass was loaded on her phone, valid and verified and time-stamped. She had done everything right. She had done everything right her entire life, and she was about to discover, one more time, that it didn't always matter. The gate for Flight 1147 was Gate C44, down at the far end of the terminal where the building bent slightly east and the pre-dawn darkness was most visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was 5:48 in the morning. The gate area was occupied by maybe 30 people, business travelers mostly, the kind who wore the airport like a second skin, who moved through security with the calm efficiency of long practice, who had their laptops out and their protein bars unwrapped before the gate agent had even made the first boarding announcement. Vivienne found a seat near the window, set her carry-on at her feet, and opened the leather portfolio that contained her notes for the week ahead. She was traveling to San Francisco for a 3-day summit at the Global Aerospace Innovation Conference, an event she hadn't simply been invited to attend, but had been asked to keynote. Her talk was titled Rethinking the Skin of Flight, the Next 50 Years of Commercial Aircraft Architecture, and the organizers had been pursuing her for 2 years before she finally agreed to appear. She reviewed her notes for perhaps 20 minutes while the gate area slowly filled. She noticed, without particular interest, that she was one of very few black passengers in the first-class boarding zone. This was not unusual. She had been one of very few black women in nearly every room she had occupied for the past 2 decades. She had long since stopped counting. At 6:03, the gate agent, a young white man with sandy hair and a Transamerica badge that read Derek, made the first boarding announcement. Transamerica Airlines Flight 1147 to San Francisco is now boarding. We will begin with our first-class cabin and Platinum Elite members. First-class passengers, please proceed to the gate. Vivienne closed her portfolio, picked up her bag, and joined the small line forming at the podium. There were 6 people ahead of her. 2 couples and 2 solo travelers. They scanned their boarding passes one by one, chatted briefly with Derek, and moved through the jetway door without incident. Vivienne stepped forward. She held her phone out, the boarding pass displayed clearly on the screen. Seat 2A. First class. Her name in bold letters. Dr. Vivienne Calloway Rhodes. Derek looked at the screen. He looked at her. He looked at the screen again. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, the kind of micro-expression that most people wouldn't notice, but that Vivienne had developed a finely calibrated sensitivity to over a lifetime of navigating spaces that hadn't been designed with her in mind. It was a flicker of something between doubt and calculation, and it lasted less than a second before it was replaced by a professional smile. "Can I see your ID as well, Vivienne reached into her portfolio and produced her driver's license without comment. Derek studied it with what seemed like unnecessary care. He compared it to the boarding pass. He typed something into his computer. He frowned slightly at the screen. "Is there a problem?" Vivienne asked. "Just one moment, He picked up the phone handset on the podium and dialed. He spoke quietly into it, his voice too low for Vivienne to make out the words, though she caught the word first class and then what sounded like just want to verify. Behind her, the line had grown. 3 more passengers had joined it since she stepped up to the podium. She could feel the quiet impatience building. Derek hung up the phone. "I'm going to need you to step aside for just a moment. We're just doing a routine verification." "Routine," Vivienne said. "Yes, just a standard check. You didn't ask for ID from anyone else in this line." We do it randomly, It's a security protocol." "I see," Vivienne said. And she stepped aside, because she knew, had always known, that making a scene here, in this line, in this airport, before a single witness with authority had seen what was happening, would only make her position worse. She had learned this not from any formal instruction but from the accumulated experience of being a black woman in America, which was its own kind of graduate school with a curriculum that never ended and a tuition paid in indignities. She stood to the side of the podium and waited while Derek processed the remaining first-class passengers one by one, checking none of their IDs, scanning none of their tickets with the same extended scrutiny. When the last of them had passed through the door, Derek made another call. This one lasted longer. Her name was Sandra Kowalczyk, and she was the lead flight attendant, the purser, in the language of the airline industry, for Transamerica Flight 1147. She was 51 years old, had worked for Transamerica for 22 years, and carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had spent 2 decades managing the confined social ecosystem of an aircraft cabin and had developed strong opinions about how that ecosystem should be maintained. She appeared at the jetway door approximately 4 minutes after Derek's second call, walking with the brisk purpose of someone who has been interrupted mid-task and intends to resolve the interruption quickly. She looked at Vivienne. She looked at the boarding pass on Vivienne's phone. She looked at Derek. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, and the question was technically directed at Derek, but her eyes had returned to Vivienne. "I'm just trying to board," Vivienne said. "I have a valid first-class ticket." "We're just confirming the purchase," Sandra said. There was some concern about the booking. "What concern?" Vivienne asked. "I booked this seat 11 days ago. You can see the confirmation number right here." She held up her phone and pointed to the booking reference. "You can look it up in your system." Sandra took Vivienne's phone, studied it, handed it back. "Where did you purchase this ticket?" "Through the Transamerica website. Directly." "And the credit card, is it yours?" There it was. Vivienne had been waiting for some version of this question since Derek had first asked her to step aside. And she had prepared herself for it. She breathed slowly, evenly, through the bottom of her lungs the way she had learned to do 20 years ago when a professor at Caltech had told her, in so many words, that her dissertation proposal was ambitious for someone of your background, and she had needed to stay in the room and finish the meeting without breaking down or burning anything. "Yes," she said. "The credit card is mine. Would you like me to show it to you?" "That would be helpful." Vivienne produced her American Express Platinum card and held it out. Sandra examined it, then examined the boarding pass, then handed it back. "I'm going to need to verify this with our ticketing office," Sandra said. "It will just take a few minutes." "The flight boards in 12 minutes, Vivienne said. "I understand that. This won't take long." And Sandra turned and walked back through the jetway door, her heels clicking with efficient finality on the gangway floor. What followed was 19 minutes of waiting. 19 minutes during which Vivienne Callaway Rhodes, aerospace engineer, MIT PhD, NASA veteran, stood beside gate C44 while the boarding completed around her. She watched the line dwindle and disappear. She watched Derek close the gate podium and pick up the phone twice more. She watched a second airline employee, a young woman in a Transamerica vest, her name tag reading Patricia, arrive, look at her, whisper something to Derek, and look at her again. She stood very still throughout all of it. She thought about the keynote speech she was scheduled to deliver in 36 hours. She thought about the 700 engineers and aviation executives who would be in that auditorium. She thought about the aircraft she was standing inside a jetway waiting to board, a Transamerica T-47, which was what the airline called it in its marketing materials, though its manufacturer designation was the Vantara V-Series wide-body. And she thought about the particular piece of engineering that had consumed 4 years of her life and that now resided in the structural skin of this very aircraft and every other V-Series in the Transamerica fleet. She thought about whether to say something about this. She decided not to. Not yet. She would give them the chance to resolve it themselves first. They did not take that chance. Sandra reappeared at the jetway door at 6:22, 7 minutes past the scheduled departure time. Behind her was a man in a Transamerica supervisor's jacket, his badge reading Marcus Whitehill, Ground Operations Supervisor. He was perhaps 35, with the manner of someone who had been woken up by an unpleasant phone call and was trying to project authority while still processing the inconvenience. Ms. Callaway Rhodes, he said, and he said Ms., not Dr., though the name on her ticket was clearly printed with the title. It's Dr., Vivienne said. A brief pause. Dr. Callaway Rhodes. I'm Marcus Whitehill, the Ground Operations Supervisor. I apologize for the delay. I want to assure you this is a purely routine. It is not routine, Vivienne said, and her voice was calm and clear and precise, the voice she used in conference rooms when a presentation was going in the wrong direction. I have watched every other first-class passenger on this flight board without any ID check, credit card verification, or supervisor involvement. I am the only passenger who has been subjected to this process. I would like to know the reason. Marcus Whitehill clasped his hands in front of him. I understand your frustration. I'm not frustrated, Vivienne said. I'm asking a question. And I want to assure you that Transamerica takes all concerns about. Can I board my flight? Another pause. Longer this time. We're still working to verify. What? Vivienne said, and her voice dropped by half a degree, which somehow made it more precise. Exactly, are you working to verify? You have my boarding pass. You have my ID. You have my credit card. You have my confirmation number. What verification remains? Marcus Whitehill looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at the floor. Patricia had disappeared. Doctor, we have had some issues in the past with unauthorized access to our premium cabin. Show me, Vivienne said, a single piece of evidence that my ticket is unauthorized. He couldn't. Because there wasn't any. He knew it. She knew it. Sandra knew it. And yet, if you could just wait a few more minutes while we... I have waited 19 minutes, Vivienne said. The flight was scheduled to depart 7 minutes ago. If I miss this flight, I miss my connection window for the conference I am traveling to present at. I would like to board. Now. She boarded. Eventually. After 4 more minutes of hushed phone calls and what appeared to be a terse exchange between Marcus Whitehill and someone on the other end of a radio. She was escorted down the jetway by Sandra, escorted, as if she were a risk to be managed rather than a passenger to be served, and she walked onto the aircraft with the quiet dignity of someone who had decided, very deliberately, that her carriage would not reflect the treatment she had received. She found her seat. Seat 2A. Window. First class. It was exactly where her ticket said it would be. She stored her carry-on in the overhead bin, settled into the wide leather seat, and opened her portfolio to the notes she had been reviewing at the gate. Around her, the first-class cabin hummed with the quiet industry of pre-departure. 2 other passengers in the front rows were already asleep. A man in a charcoal suit across the aisle was reviewing something on his laptop. The aircraft smelled of recycled air and the faint chemical sweetness of cabin cleaning solution. She had been on hundreds of flights in her career. She had been on this specific aircraft type, the Vantara V series, perhaps 40 times, in various cabins, for various conferences and site visits and client meetings. She knew the sound of its engines spooling up. She knew the particular vibration that ran through the fuselage during pushback. She knew the way the cabin pressure equalized during initial climb, and she knew it because she had helped design the systems that made it happen. She knew this plane the way a sculptor knows a particular piece of marble. And now she sat inside it, in the window seat of the first-class cabin, with a cup of black coffee, finally brought to her by a different flight attendant, a young man named Antoine who seemed blissfully unaware of what had transpired at the gate, and she opened her notes and tried to work. She had almost succeeded in setting the morning aside when Sandra appeared at the front of the cabin and began the standard safety briefing. The safety briefing that preceded every flight on every Vantara V-series aircraft in the world. The safety briefing that included, on slide 7 of the video component displayed on the seat back screens, a very specific graphic of the aircraft's cross-section, including the composite fuselage skin, the carbon fiber reinforcement ribs, and the multilayer titanium alloy structural frame. A cross-section that Vivienne had drawn, by hand, in 2017. She watched it flicker past on the small screen in the seat back in front of her. She said nothing. She turned back to her notes. She would give them a little longer. But the morning was not finished with her yet. Not by a long way. Subscribe now and hit the bell. Act 2 is where everything begins to unravel, and you do not want to miss what Sandra finds in the galley that changes the entire story. Speech balloon engagement question. Have you ever been doubted in a space you fully deserve to be in? Drop your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. The Vantara V-series wide-body, Transamerica's T-47, in the airline's house language, was at that moment one of the most sophisticated commercial aircraft in service anywhere in the world. Its wing design had been refined over 9 iterations using computational fluid dynamics software that hadn't existed when the project began. Its landing gear assembly incorporated a shock absorption mechanism that reduced structural fatigue on hard landings by 31% compared to the previous generation. Its cabin pressure management system was precise enough to maintain sea level equivalent conditions, something almost no other commercial aircraft could achieve, reducing passenger fatigue on long-haul flights by a clinically measurable margin. And its fuselage. Its fuselage was the thing that engineering publications kept writing about. The skin of the V-series was built from a composite material that Vivienne's team at Vantara Systems had developed and patented, a layered structure of carbon fiber we've embedded in a thermoset polymer matrix, reinforced at stress concentration points by a titanium alloy frame that Vivienne herself had specified down to the molecular grain structure of the metal. The result was a fuselage that was 11% lighter than the previous generation, 23% stronger, and capable of tolerating a range of pressurization cycles nearly double that of comparable designs. There was a patent on the composite layering process. Vivienne's name was on it. There was a second patent on the frame geometry. Her name was on that one too. Her name was on 4 patents in total that were embedded in the physical structure of the aircraft she was currently sitting inside, at 35,000 feet, being watched. She had noticed it approximately 40 minutes after departure. The watching. Sandra had established a particular quality of attention directed at seat 2A, the kind that was careful not to be obvious but wasn't careful enough. When she moved through the cabin to offer drink refills, she lingered briefly at the row ahead of Vivienne. When she returned to the forward galley, she walked at an angle that kept Vivienne in her peripheral vision. Antoine, the younger flight attendant, had been warm and professional. Sandra was neither warm nor professional in anything that could be called a genuine sense. She was polished, which was different. She performed the gestures of professionalism, the appropriate smile, the measured tone, the practiced courtesy, without any of the actual regard for persons that made professionalism mean something. Vivienne had met many people like Sandra. She had met more of them than she would have preferred. At roughly 1 hour and 20 minutes into the flight, when the cabin had settled into its cruising rhythm and most of the first-class passengers were either sleeping or absorbed in their seat back screens, Vivienne got up to use the lavatory. The first-class lavatory was at the very front of the cabin, adjacent to the forward galley, a small, efficiently designed space that was quieter and better appointed than those in economy but still, in the final analysis, a tiny pressurized box. On her way back to her seat, she passed the forward galley. The galley curtain was mostly drawn, but not entirely, and the aircraft's particular acoustic geometry, a fact that she knew not because she was eavesdropping but because she had once, in 2016, reviewed the acoustic analysis reports for the V-series cabin and had noted, in a margin comment that she doubted anyone had ever followed up on, that the galley area at frame 8 had an unusual reflective quality that could carry sound further than intended, meant that she heard, clearly, without any ambiguity, what was being said on the other side of that curtain. Sandra's voice. Speaking to someone, presumably Patricia, whose presence Vivienne had noted on the crew manifest that Sandra had been holding during boarding. I don't care what the ticket says. Someone put her up to this. A murmur. The other voice. No, I'm telling you. That seat was supposed to go to Mr. Harrington if he'd taken the upgrade, and then it went on last-minute release. Look at the booking time, 11 days ago. You think she just happened to have that kind of money? Another murmur. Quieter. I'm not saying anything improper, Patricia. I'm saying the optics are what they are and I'm not going to be the one who, no, listen. Vivienne had heard enough. She walked back to her seat. She sat down. She placed her hands flat on the tray table in front of her and breathed. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Slowly. The way she had learned. The optics are what they are. She had been hearing versions of this sentence her entire career. At MIT, where a classmate had once told her, not maliciously, he would have insisted, just honestly, that she was obviously smart, but you have to understand how it looks when someone like you gets the fellowship. At NASA, where a supervisor had suggested, very kindly, that she might want to let someone else present the quarterly review because the optics with the congressional delegation could be sensitive. At Vantara Systems, where she had once sat in a room while 3 colleagues debated, in front of her, whether to put her name first on the patent filing or bury it a bit to avoid the diversity optics from the other side. The optics are what they are. She understood what the sentence meant. It meant, your achievement is real, but your existence makes certain people uncomfortable, and we have decided that their comfort is more important than your reality. She had never accepted this calculus. She did not accept it now. She opened her portfolio. She found the page she was looking for. It was a printed copy of the conference program, the Global Aerospace Innovation Conference, San Francisco, 3 days, 112 speakers, 4 keynotes. She looked at her name on the program. Looked at the title of her talk. Looked at the brief biography printed in 10-point type beside it, which ran to a full paragraph and included, in the second sentence, the words lead structural architect of the Vantara V-series fuselage system, now in service with 11 commercial airlines across 4 continents. 11 commercial airlines. Transamerica was the 3rd largest of them. She put the program back in her portfolio. She was thinking. Approximately 30 minutes after the exchange she had overheard in the galley, Sandra made her way through the first-class cabin with a tray of pre-lunch snacks. Small portions of mixed nuts and dried fruit, the kind of token offering that airlines provided in first class to justify the price differential before the actual meal service began. She moved efficiently down the aisle, pausing at each seat. When she reached seat 2A, she did not pause. She continued to the seat behind. The man across the aisle received his nuts. The woman 2 rows back received her nuts. The couple at the rear of the first-class section received their nuts. Vivienne received nothing. She watched this happen with a kind of exhausted clarity. Not anger, she had moved past anger in the gate area and through something else entirely in the lavatory corridor, and was now occupying a space that was calmer and more focused and, in its own way, more dangerous. She pressed the call button. The small light above her seat illuminated. Sandra appeared from the forward galley 30 seconds later, her expression professionally composed. Is there something I can help you with? You skipped my row during the snack service. Sandra's eyes moved to the tray in her hand, where 2 portions of mixed nuts remained. Back to Vivienne. My apologies. I must have overlooked. You didn't overlook, Vivienne said pleasantly. You deliberately skipped it. I was watching. She smiled, and the smile contained nothing warm. I'll have the mixed nuts, please. There was a pause of perhaps 2 full seconds. Then Sandra set one of the portions on Vivienne's tray table, said of course, with an inflection that managed to convey both apology and its opposite simultaneously, and walked away. Here is what was happening in the cockpit while all of this was unfolding in the cabin. Flight 1147 was being captained by Captain James Okafor, a 49-year-old Nigerian-American aviator who had been flying commercial aircraft for 21 years, the last 11 of them with Transamerica. He was a methodical man, well regarded by his colleagues, known for his unruffled composure in turbulent conditions, meteorological and human alike. He had flown the V-Series for 4 years and held it in high professional regard. His first officer was a woman named Chen Wei, 32, on her 47th flight as first officer after being upgraded from co-pilot, and the two of them had fallen into an easy working rhythm over the 18 months they had been paired. At approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes into the flight, Captain Okafor received a message on the crew communication system from the Ground Operations Center in Chicago. It was a routine message, a weather update for the San Francisco approach, but it arrived attached to a flight log note from Marcus Whitehill that summarized the boarding incident at Gate C-44. Captain Okafor read the note. Then he read it again. He looked at the passenger manifest, which was always loaded into the cockpit system before departure. He scrolled to seat 2A. Dr. Vivienne Calloway Rhodes. He recognized the name immediately. He sat very still for a moment. Then he turned to First Officer Chen. Wei, he said. Sir. He turned his screen slightly toward her. Look at the name in seat 2A. She looked. Calloway Rhodes. A pause. The Calloway Rhodes. The V-Series architect. The same. First Officer Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, and they detained her at the gate. Apparently. Another silence. The aircraft hummed around them. Below, somewhere over the farmland of Iowa, clouds were organizing themselves into weather. What are you going to do? First Officer Chen asked. Captain Okafor thought about this question for perhaps 30 seconds. He was not a man given to reactive decisions. He believed in information, procedure, and measured action. First, he said, I'm going to find out exactly what happened. He picked up the interphone. Sandra Kowalczyk had been a flight attendant for 22 years. In those 22 years, she had received exactly 1 call from the cockpit that was not about a turbulence update or a schedule change or a passenger medical issue. This was the second. She answered the interphone in the forward galley on the second ring, and when Captain Okafor identified himself and asked her, in a quiet and measured tone, to describe the boarding situation with the passenger in seat 2A, she did. She described it as a routine verification process prompted by a last-minute premium booking, and she used the word protocol 4 times, which was 3 times more than the word warranted. Captain Okafor listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, Thank you, Sandra. I'd like you to do something for me. Of course, Captain. Go to your crew bag and find the conference materials packet that operations sent up for this flight. The one for the Global Aerospace Innovation Conference in San Francisco. We're carrying a number of conference attendees today. A pause. Yes, I believe I have that packet. In that packet, Captain Okafor said, there's a conference program. I'd like you to open it to the keynote speaker section and tell me what you find. The silence that followed lasted 19 seconds. Vivienne could not have known this, sitting in seat 2A with her portfolio open and her black coffee cooling in the cup holder. She could not have known that 19 seconds of silence in a first-class galley, 35,000 feet above the state of Iowa, was the precise sound of someone realizing, fully and completely, what they had done. What Sandra said, in a voice that had lost its Polish entirely. Oh! Captain Okafor's second call was to the Transamerica Ground Operations Center in Chicago. He spoke to a senior dispatcher and asked that the interaction log for Flight 1147's departure be flagged and preserved. He requested that Marcus Whitehill's report be filed under an active review, not archived. He used the particular language of someone who understood institutional processes, not threatening, not inflammatory, but precise in a way that meant I know what I'm asking and I know what it means. His third call was not a call at all. He unfastened his seat belt, said you have the aircraft, way, and walked out of the cockpit. Narrator, quiet, intense. The door between the cockpit and the first-class cabin opens directly behind the forward galley. When Captain Okafor stepped through it, he found Sandra standing very still, holding the conference program in both hands, and he found her face doing something he had not seen it do in any of the 40-odd flights they had flown together. It was doing the face that faces do when a certainty collapses. He didn't address her. He walked into the first-class cabin. He walked to seat 2A. He crouched slightly so that he was at eye level with the woman sitting there, a woman who looked up from her portfolio with an expression of mild curiosity, the kind worn by someone who has learned not to project expectations onto unexpected arrivals. Dr. Calloway Rhodes, he said. She looked at him. A careful look. Assessing. Captain, she said. I've just been reviewing your profile on the conference materials we have on board. He said this directly, without preamble. And I owe you an apology on behalf of this flight crew for what happened at the gate this morning. It was wrong. Unambiguously wrong. And I am sorry. She held his gaze for a moment. I appreciate that, she said. I also want you to know, he continued, that I flagged the incident with ground operations and requested it be preserved for formal review. Not to create difficulty for anyone in particular, but because what happened this morning should not happen to anyone, and someone in authority needs to know about it. She nodded once. And, he said, and there was something different in his voice here, something between professional respect and what might be called or could be worn quietly, I fly this aircraft 4 times a week. I have flown this aircraft for 4 years. And every time I walk through the door and settle into that seat and we push back from the gate, I feel, he paused, as if searching for the right word. I feel held. Solidly held. The way you feel in an aircraft when you trust the engineering completely. He looked at her. That's your work. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. It's extraordinary work. She looked at him for a long moment. And then something shifted in her expression. Something very small, very controlled, but visible to anyone who was paying close attention. Something that might have been the precise, private dissolution of a professional composure that had been maintained at extraordinary cost since 5:48 that morning. Thank you, she said. And her voice, for the first time since the gate, was not controlled. It was just her voice. #subscribe and ring that bell right now. Act 3 is where the real confrontation happens, and the twist you're about to hear will absolutely stop you cold. Speech balloon engagement question. At what moment in this story did you feel the most tension? Tell me in the comments, I want to know which line hit you hardest. There are moments in any confrontation, and make no mistake, what was unfolding aboard Transamerica Flight 1147 was a confrontation, even when it was silent, even when it wore the costume of customer service and operational protocol. There are moments when the power dynamic shifts. Not visibly, not loudly, not with the drama that films would have you expect. It shifts the way a tidal current shifts, deep below the surface, almost impossible to detect from above, but carrying so much force that everything floating on the water eventually goes where it insists. Captain Okafor's appearance in the cabin was the moment when the current shifted. But the full weight of what was shifting, the complete, terrible, clarifying weight of it, had not yet come to rest on anyone who needed it most. Not yet. After Captain Okafor returned to the cockpit, the first-class cabin was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not the comfortable quiet of sleeping passengers and ambient engine noise, but the tighter, more charged quiet of people who had registered that something unusual had occurred. The man in the charcoal suit across the aisle had looked up from his laptop when the captain crouched at seat 2A. He hadn't looked away. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the particular attentiveness of someone who spent his professional life reading rooms, an attorney, possibly, or someone in senior management. He met Vivienne's eyes briefly after the captain left, and gave a small nod. Not intrusive. Just acknowledging. She acknowledged it back. Antoine, the younger flight attendant, had watched the entire exchange from the rear of the first-class section. His face had been doing several things simultaneously. He had come forward after the captain left and asked, with genuine warmth, if Vivienne needed anything, and she had asked for a fresh coffee, and he had brought it within 2 minutes, and the speed and attentiveness of the service contained its own small statement. Sandra had not reappeared in the cabin. She was in the galley. And in the galley, she was doing something that Vivienne could not see but that anyone familiar with the particular psychologies of people who have committed avoidable wrongs and are beginning to understand the full dimension of those wrongs might have recognized. She was reading. She had the conference program open to the keynote section. Dr. Vivienne Callaway Rhodes, PhD, Lead Structural Architect, Vantara V-Series Wide Body Program Former Senior Engineer, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory Chief Design Engineer, Vantara Systems, Aerospace Division, Patent Holder. VS 2017 CF4, Composite Fuselage Layering Process. VS 2018 TF7, Titanium Frame Geometry System. VS 2019 CS2, Cabin Pressure Management Architecture. VS 2021 WL1, Wing Load Distribution System. She read the keynote title, Rethinking the Skin of Flight, The Next 50 Years of Commercial Aircraft Architecture. She read the biography. She read it again. She set the program down on the galley counter and placed both hands on the stainless steel surface and stared at them. Patricia, who had been with her in the galley for the past 20 minutes, was very quiet. I didn't know, Sandra said. No, Patricia said. I mean, how would I have known? Patricia said nothing. There was nothing on the ticket that said Sandra. Patricia's voice was gentle but clear. It didn't matter what was on the ticket. That was never the point. Sandra looked up. It didn't matter if she was a PhD or a janitor, Patricia said. It didn't matter if she'd never been on a plane before in her life. She had a valid first-class ticket. That was the only thing that was supposed to matter. Sandra was quiet for a long time. I know that, she said finally. I know you know it, Patricia said. But knowing it and doing it are different things. And today you didn't do it. Narrator, careful now, deliberate. Let me tell you about the specific texture of professional humiliation, because it is different from other kinds of humiliation and it matters to this story. Personal humiliation, the kind that happens in private, between people who know each other, has a particular rawness to it, the way physical pain is raw. It hurts where you are, and it hurts fully, and it passes through you and leaves a scar that you carry forward. Professional humiliation, the kind that happens in front of colleagues, in spaces defined by your role and your title and the years you have invested in becoming who you professionally are, has a different texture entirely. It is cold. It is structural. It is the humiliation of having your competence questioned not by someone who knows you but by the architecture of the institution you have served, and it damages not just your feelings but your professional self, the identity you have spent decades constructing. Sandra Kowalczyk had never been professionally humiliated in 22 years of service. She was about to be. It began with a message. Not from the captain. He had done what he was going to do and returned to the cockpit and was managing his aircraft with the same steady professionalism with which he managed everything. The message came from the ground. From the Transamerica Corporate Operations Center in Chicago, which had received Captain Okafor's flag and Marcus Whitehill's incident report and was now, at 35,000 feet over the Nevada desert, 90 minutes from San Francisco, beginning to understand what the morning had produced. The message came through the cabin crew communication system and was received by Sandra on the small screen in the forward galley. It was from the Vice President of In-Flight Customer Experience, a position Sandra had met exactly once, at a crew recognition ceremony 3 years earlier, and it was brief. Regarding incident on Flight 1147 this date, passenger in seat 2A confirmed as Dr. Vivienne Callaway Rhodes, invited keynote speaker at GAIC conference and lead architect of Vantara V-Series structural systems. Incident is under formal review. Please note that Dr. Callaway Rhodes is a named VIP for this carrier. In-flight team is expected to ensure remainder of flight is handled with full protocol priority. We'll speak further upon landing. Sandra read the message. Named VIP. Full protocol priority. We'll speak further upon landing. She understood every word. She set the screen down. She straightened her jacket. She picked up a fresh tray. Here is where the story becomes interesting in a way that simple narratives of justice don't always capture. Because Vivienne, sitting in seat 2A with her second coffee and her conference notes and the quiet composed posture of someone who has been managing a very long day, saw Sandra emerge from the galley with the fresh tray. She watched Sandra walk toward her. She knew, from Sandra's bearing, the subtle difference between the Sandra who had stood over her at the gate and the Sandra who was walking toward her now, that something had changed. That Sandra had learned something. That whatever professional machinery existed in the airline to respond to incidents of this kind had been activated, and that Sandra's posture was now shaped by an awareness of consequence that had been entirely absent at gate C44. She watched Sandra stop at her row. Dr. Calloway Rhodes. And the title now, The Doctor, was precise and careful. On behalf of the entire crew of Flight 1147, I would like to apologize for the experience you had at the gate this morning. What happened was unacceptable, and I take personal responsibility for the role I played in it. I'm deeply sorry. The words were correct. They were the right words. Vivienne looked at her. May I ask you something? She said. Of course. Would you have treated me the same way if you had known who I was at the gate? Sandra blinked. Of course not. I would never. Why not? Sandra opened her mouth. Closed it. Why would knowing my credentials have changed your behavior? The ticket was valid either way. My right to that seat existed whether I have a PhD or not. Whether I've ever heard of Vantara systems or not. Whether I'm traveling to give a keynote speech or traveling to attend the conference or traveling to see my family in San Francisco. She held Sandra's gaze, steadily. What you did to me at that gate was not about my credentials. It was about my skin. And I need you to understand that, specifically, not because knowing it will be comfortable, but because if you don't understand it specifically, the next person who sits in this seat will go through exactly what I went through. And they won't have the career I have. And it will still be wrong. Sandra stood very still. The man in the charcoal suit across the aisle had closed his laptop. Antoine, halfway down the cabin, was very still. The aircraft hummed around all of them. You're right, Sandra said. She said it quietly. Without the polish. Without the performance. Just the two words, plain and exposed, the way truths often are when they finally arrive. You're right, and I'm genuinely sorry. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. I accept your apology, she said. I hope you'll do the work. Sandra nodded once and walked back to the galley. Here is what doing the work means when a person of Sandra's age and tenure and particular history says they intend to do it. It means more than reading a diversity brochure or attending a mandatory online training module, though both of those things might happen. It means something harder and more personal, the sustained, uncomfortable project of examining the assumptions so thoroughly embedded in one's daily behavior that they feel like intuition, feel like professional judgment, feel like protocol, when in fact they are something else entirely. It means asking the question Sandra had not asked herself at gate C44. Why is this specific person, and not any of the others, prompting me to doubt? It means sitting with the answer to that question without deflecting it. It means doing this not once but repeatedly, with every interaction, for a very long time, until the instinct to doubt certain people in certain spaces is replaced by something more honest and more fair. Some people do this work. Some people don't. Sandra Kowalczyk was, at 35,000 feet over the Nevada desert, at the very beginning of the question. Whether she would reach the answer was not a story that would resolve in the next 90 minutes. But the question had been posed. By the right person. At the right moment. In the right space, the skin of an aircraft that the woman in seat 2A had helped design, and that was holding all of them in the air. The man in the charcoal suit across the aisle introduced himself 40 minutes before landing. His name was Gerald Achempong. He was 52 years old. He was a senior partner at a firm called Hartley & Achempong in Washington, D.C., and he specialized in aviation law and consumer discrimination claims. He had been on his way to San Francisco for a separate conference, a legal symposium at Stanford, when he had watched what he watched at gate C44 and in the cabin of Flight 1147. He handed Vivienne a business card. You don't have to do anything with this, he said. But you should know your options. Vivienne looked at the card. I'm not sure I want to litigate, she said. That's entirely your choice, Gerald said. There are options short of litigation. Formal complaints. Official records. Institutional accountability. He paused. What happened to you this morning was not a misunderstanding. It was discrimination, and it was documented. By the gate agent's own communications, by the incident log Marcus Whitehill filed, by the captain's flag. The documentation exists. What you do with it is up to you. Vivienne held the card between two fingers and thought about it. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm suggesting. She put the card in her portfolio. There is a moment on every flight, if you pay attention, if you know what you're listening for, when the engine note changes. It's subtle. The pitch drops just fractionally. The sense of forward momentum shifts almost imperceptibly toward downward. If you're a frequent flyer, you might notice it and think nothing of it, just the beginning of the descent. If you're a nervous flyer, it might cause a small spike of anxiety that dissipates when nothing alarming follows. If you are an aerospace engineer who helped design the engine mount interface on the aircraft you're currently descending in, you notice it the way a composer notices a wrong note in a piece of music you wrote yourself. The engine note on Flight 1147, at approximately 45 minutes before landing, was not wrong. But something else was. Vivienne had been half listening to the aircraft, as she always did, almost unconsciously, the way physicians sometimes half listen to the breathing of people around them, attuned to the particular sounds of distress even in social settings, and she became, slowly, aware of a very faint vibration in the fuselage. Not in the window or the tray table, those always vibrated in moderate turbulence. This was deeper. Structural. A vibration at a frequency that she could feel in the back of her molars and the base of her sternum, and that she recognized, from thousands of hours of test data review and failure mode analysis, as something that had a cause. She sat very still. She listened. She felt. The vibration was intermittent. 8 to 12 seconds on, then absent. Then present again. She reached into her portfolio and found a pen. She began writing. Frequency estimate. Duration. Interval pattern. She was calm. She was not panicking. An intermittent vibration of this nature could have a dozen causes, most of them benign and many of them addressable. But she knew, from the test data she had lived inside for 4 years, that 2 or 3 of the possible causes in that frequency range were not benign and were not something that could wait for the post-flight inspection. She pressed the call button. Antoine appeared. Is there something? I need to speak with the captain, she said. He blinked. Typically passengers. Tell Captain Okafor, she said, that Dr. Callaway Rhodes would like to report an anomalous fuselage vibration with a frequency and pattern consistent with a possible anomaly in the aft pressure frame. Tell him exactly that. He will understand. Antoine stared at her for a half-second. Then he walked, very quickly, to the forward galley. Black down arrow #subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Act 4 is the final act, and what happens in the cockpit in the next 15 minutes will change every single thing about this story. Speech balloon engagement question. Did you see that coming? What did you think that vibration meant when you first heard about it? Tell me your theory in the comments. Let's talk. Captain James Okafor had been a pilot long enough to know that the most dangerous moments in commercial aviation were not the dramatic ones. They were not the moments when warning lights flashed and alarms sounded and the situation announced itself with unmistakable urgency. The most dangerous moments were the subtle ones. The small anomalies that didn't quite trigger the warning systems. The vibrations that fell just below the threshold of the automated detection algorithms. The deviations that a computer would log and a human being, distracted by other tasks or too confident in the automation, would overlook. He had learned this lesson early, and he had carried it through 21 years of flight operations with a vigilance that his colleagues sometimes called excessive and that had, on 2 separate occasions, caught things that the automation had missed. When Antoine relayed Dr. Callaway Rhodes's message through the interphone, Captain Okafor had 2 simultaneous reactions. The first was the professional response of a pilot receiving a potentially significant anomaly report from a credible source. The second was something harder to name, a kind of deep, clarifying irony that he would think about for a long time after this day was over. The woman his crew had questioned and detained and watched with suspicion was now, 30 minutes before landing, the most important person on the aircraft. He immediately initiated a structural vibration diagnostic through the onboard monitoring system. The system returned a yellow flag on the aft pressure frame sensor. The flag was new. It had not been present at departure. It had appeared, according to the timestamp, 17 minutes ago. Approximately the time Vivienne had first noticed the vibration. "Wait," he said. "I see it," she said. She was already on the radio to San Francisco approach. The aft pressure frame was one of the primary structural elements of the V-series fuselage. It was the ring frame that bore the pressure differential between the cabin interior and the external atmosphere at altitude. A hairline fatigue crack in the aft pressure frame, the kind that might develop after a high-cycle aircraft reached a particular point in its service life, or after a specific kind of hard landing sequence, or after certain kinds of pressurization anomalies, could, under certain conditions, propagate rapidly under the loading conditions of landing. This was one of the scenarios that Vivienne had spent 4 years designing against. It was also one of the scenarios in her failure mode analysis that had the tightest margin. Captain Okafor picked up the interphone. "Dr. Callaway Rhodes," he said. "This is the captain. I have a structural diagnostic flag consistent with what you reported. I want to ask you directly, based on what you're feeling and your knowledge of the aircraft, what is your assessment of the risk level for a standard landing approach?" There was a brief pause. "What's your fuel situation?" she asked. "We can hold for 40 minutes if needed." "And your diagnostic shows the flag at what sensor location?" He read her the sensor code. Another pause. Shorter this time. The pause of someone running calculations. "That's the left aft frame junction, frame 22 in the V-series system. The standard landing approach loads that junction at approximately 68% of the design maximum. If the flag is reading an anomaly there, I would not recommend a standard approach rate. I would recommend a reduced rate approach, full flap configuration, lower descent speed, softer landing sequence. Reduce the loading impulse at touchdown by at least 30%. That's within your aircraft performance envelope. You'll need to cross-check with your numbers, but I believe you can achieve it." "We can," said First Officer Chen, who had been listening on the same channel and running the calculations. "If you do that," Vivienne continued, "and if the anomaly is what I think it is, a fatigue indicator rather than an active propagating crack, the risk drops to an acceptable margin. You'll want a full structural inspection immediately post-landing. Don't fly the aircraft again until it's been inspected." "Understood," Captain Okafor said. "Thank you." "Also," she said, and her voice had changed slightly, lighter, almost dry, "you'll want to log that the detection came from a passenger." He smiled. It was not a small smile. "I already have." The approach into San Francisco International that afternoon was, by any observable standard, unremarkable. The passengers in the first-class cabin of Flight 1147 felt a slightly slower, smoother descent than usual. The final approach was a little more gradual. The flare before touchdown was extended perhaps 2 seconds beyond what a frequent flyer might have expected. The landing itself was, by the standards of passengers who were not paying particular attention, simply a good landing. Smooth. Clean. Controlled. Not one of the passengers. Not the man in the charcoal suit, not the sleeping couple at the rear of first class, not any of the 214 passengers in the main cabin who had spent the flight entirely unaware of what had unfolded in the rows ahead of them, felt anything unusual. They gathered their bags. They waited for the seatbelt sign to turn off. They organized themselves for the patient, slightly shuffling process of deplaning. Vivienne Callaway Rhodes sat in seat 2A until the first-class cabin had mostly cleared. She was not in a hurry. She had arrived. When she stepped off the aircraft into the jetway, Captain Okafor was waiting. He had come through the cockpit door, leaving First Officer Chen at the aircraft controls as the post-flight systems powered down, and he was standing in the narrow corrugated corridor of the jetway with his cap in his hands and a look on his face that was difficult to categorize. "Dr. Callaway Rhodes," he said. She stopped. "I just want to say again, What happened this morning at the gate was wrong. The way you were treated on this aircraft was wrong. And the fact that you then," he paused, seemed to be choosing words carefully. "The fact that you set all of that aside, and did what you did in the cabin, reported the anomaly, advised on the approach, that took a quality of character that I don't have a professional language for." She regarded him. "I set it aside," she said, "because 227 people were on this aircraft, and whether or not I had been treated fairly had no bearing on whether they should land safely. Those are separate things." She paused. "But I appreciate you saying it. The maintenance crew has been alerted. They're meeting the aircraft now. We won't fly her until she's been fully inspected." "Good. And the incident report from this morning," he hesitated. "What would you like to see happen with it?" She thought about Gerald Achimpong's business card, tucked into the front pocket of her portfolio. "I want it on the record," she said. "All of it. The gate. The cabin. Sandra. Marcus Whitehill. Every minute of it. I want it documented, and I want it reviewed by someone senior enough to make a decision about what comes next." She met his eyes. "Not because I want anyone punished, but because documentation is how patterns get interrupted. And this is a pattern." Captain Okafor nodded. "I'll make sure it happens." She nodded. Picked up her bag. "Safe flying, Captain." "Safe travels, Dr. Calloway Rhodes." She walked down the jetway and into the terminal. The investigation began before she reached baggage claim. The Transamerica Director of Customer Experience, not the VP who had sent the message to the cabin crew, but the director, one level higher, who had been briefed by the VP on the descent from Chicago, was waiting in the gate area with a colleague from the airline's legal team when Vivienne emerged from the jetway. He introduced himself. He was 47, with the manner of someone who understood that whatever conversation was about to happen was not one that his company could afford to handle poorly. He asked if she had 20 minutes. She gave him 15. She sat in a chair at the gate and told him, precisely and without embellishment, exactly what had happened from the moment she stepped up to the podium at gate C44 to the moment she pressed the call button to report the structural anomaly. She was detailed. She was specific. She cited names, times, exact words where she remembered them. She handed him Gerald Achimpong's business card. "My understanding," she said, "is that your counsel will want to contact his before the end of the business day." The director looked at the card. "Yes," he said. "That would be my understanding as well." The post-flight structural inspection of the V-series aircraft that had been Flight 1147 that morning took 6 hours. The maintenance team found what they found. It was a fatigue indicator, precisely what Vivienne had suspected, at the left aft frame junction. It was a microfracture in the composite material at frame 22, approximately 4 centimeters long, propagating along a shear line that, under standard landing loads, would have continued to propagate with each subsequent flight cycle. The maintenance chief described it later in the incident report as early stage, detectable only by detailed inspection or by an individual with exceptional familiarity with the structural response characteristics of this specific airframe system. The aircraft was grounded for 12 days while the repair was completed and certified. The incident report cited, in the section on detection, the following: anomaly first identified by passenger Dr. Vivienne Calloway Rhodes, Seat 2A, Flight 1147, based on tactile detection of unusual vibration pattern. Dr. Calloway Rhodes is the lead structural architect of the V-series fuselage system and correctly identified both the location and nature of the anomaly. Her guidance on modified landing approach parameters is credited with preventing potential load cycle escalation on final approach. Prevented potential load cycle escalation, which was the technical language for, she felt something that the computers had just barely caught, and she told the right people in time, and the aircraft landed safely, and 227 people walked through the terminal and got their bags and took their connecting flights and called their families without knowing how close any of it had come to being something other than ordinary.
3 days later, Vivienne Calloway Rhodes stood at a podium in a San Francisco convention center and delivered a keynote address to 700 aerospace engineers, executives, airline operators, and regulators. Her talk was titled, as it had always been titled, Rethinking the Skin of Flight, the next 50 years of commercial aircraft architecture. She spoke for 58 minutes. She spoke about composites and failure modes and the philosophy of designing not just for expected loads, but for the unexpected ones, the corner cases, the anomalies, the situations that the models didn't quite capture. She spoke about the obligation of engineers to understand not just the nominal behavior of their systems, but the ways those systems failed, because it was in the failure modes that the real design challenges lived. She spoke about the V-Series fuselage and the 4 patents and the test data and the structural philosophy that had guided every decision her team made over the 4 years it took to bring the design from concept to certification. Near the end of her talk, she added something that wasn't in her prepared remarks. She talked about the flight from Chicago, not about Sandra or Marcus Whitehill or Derek at the gate, not about the 19 minutes of waiting or the galley conversation she'd overheard or the snack tray that didn't stop at her row. She talked about the vibration. She talked about what it meant to know a structure so deeply that you could feel in your body when something was wrong with it, not from instruments, not from readouts, from the accumulated knowledge of having spent years inside the data, inside the design decisions, inside the failure analyses, from the kind of knowing that lived not just in the mind, but somewhere more fundamental, in the hands, in the chest, in the molars. We build these structures, she said, and then we trust them with human lives. That trust has to be earned, and it has to be continually maintained. It has to be monitored and questioned and re-earned with every cycle. Complacency kills. Assumption kills. The belief that because something has always worked, it will always work, that belief kills. She looked out at the 700 faces. Know your structures, she said. Know them completely. Know how they hold, and know how they fail. Because they will tell you, if you're listening. The room was very quiet. Then it wasn't. The Transamerica Internal Review, completed 6 weeks after the incident, found that the treatment of Dr. Calloway Rhodes at Gate C-44 and in the cabin of Flight 1147 constituted a violation of the airline's non-discrimination policy, driven by racial bias. Derek, the gate agent, received a formal reprimand and was required to complete a bias awareness training program. Marcus Whitehill, the ground operations supervisor, was placed on a performance improvement plan and reassigned to a non-passenger-facing role pending review. Sandra Kowalczyk was placed on administrative leave for 3 weeks. She returned to work on restricted duties. She did not fly the V-Series route for 4 months. The airline and Dr. Calloway Rhodes reached a confidential settlement, the terms of which were not disclosed. Her attorney was Gerald Achempaw. The airline also, at the recommendation of the Incident Review Panel, made 3 institutional changes. They revised their boarding verification protocol to require documented justification for any ID or ticket verification beyond the standard scan. They implemented a mandatory scenario-based training program on implicit bias for all customer-facing employees. And they updated their named VIP recognition system to include all contracted keynote speakers, technical consultants, and board-level guests, a category that, somehow, had not previously included engineers responsible for the structural integrity of the aircraft. Narrator, very quiet now, nearly a whisper. There's a piece of the fuselage of a Vantara V-Series aircraft. Every Vantara V-Series aircraft, all 412 of them currently in service across 11 airlines on 4 continents. That corresponds to a patent number, VS 2017 CF4, which is the composite fuselage layering process patent. The holder of that patent is Dr. Vivian Calloway Rhodes. When you fly on a V-Series aircraft, and statistically, if you have flown internationally in the last 4 years, you probably have. You are held up, in part, by her thinking, her calculations, her years, her refusal to accept that something couldn't be done better, lighter, stronger, safer. You are held by her work. You have always been, whether or not anyone at the gate knew it. Here is the moral of this story. Not the moral of the incident, not the moral of the settlement, or the training programs, or the institutional policy changes. Important as all of those things are, the deeper moral, the one that lives under all the rest. Vivian Calloway Rhodes did not deserve to be treated with dignity because she had 2 PhDs. She did not deserve it because she held 4 patents. She did not deserve it, because she had spent 20 years contributing to the safety of commercial aviation, or because she could feel a structural anomaly in her molars and interpret it with more precision than the onboard monitoring system. She deserved to be treated with dignity because she was a human being, because she was a passenger with a valid ticket, because she existed in that space, in that moment, and her existence was sufficient. Everything else, the credentials, the patents, the keynote, the structural anomaly, the captain's recognition, the settlement, the apology, all of it was incidental. All of it was context. All of it mattered enormously for the specific unfolding of this specific story. But none of it was the reason she deserved better. The reason was simpler. The reason was enough. And the lesson, the one that Derek and Sandra and Marcus Whitehill and every one of us who has ever moved through a space and made an assumption about who belongs there and who doesn't. The lesson is to understand, deeply and specifically, and without the comfortable escape of credentials, why that reason is sufficient. Not because someone might be important, not because someone might be watching, not because there might be a settlement or a review board or a business card from an aviation attorney in a portfolio, but because the person in front of you is a person. Full stop. That's the structure that has to hold. That's the skin of the thing. She felt the vibration, and she reported it, and she helped them land, even after everything they had done, because that was who she was. And that, more than any patent, more than any degree, more than any keynote speech, is what made her extraordinary.